My name is Priscilla Tennant. I'm an associate pastor here at Chestnut Hill United. My pronouns are she and her, and I feel super grateful to be joining you from the sanctuary. There are 5 of us here, small but mighty team, and I haven't preached in the sanctuary in over 2 years, so I'm excited to be here in this physical space, and so glad that technology allows us to join from wherever you are. In April 2021, 3 writers published an article in The Guardian called, "If Not Hope, Then What? The Musicians Finding Optimism in Dark Times." The piece of writing is described this way. Against the backdrop of COVID, a striking number of musicians, from hard rock to jazz, made music rich with positivity in a 2-part series. They tell their stories. Part 1 of the series featured 8 artists, including John Baptiste and Michelle Zauner from Japanese Breakfast, who I hope to get cool points from my teenagers just for mentioning. In the interviews, they explain in a first-person voice the circumstances they found themselves in that inspired their songs and their albums, what they were trying to convey. The piece of art itself, the music video, is embedded almost as evidence of their testimony. For my first reading, I'll read you one of those featured interviews and play the accompanying music video for you to watch. The artist featured is professionally known as Fred Again, who I had never heard of. If you happen to be a fan, forgive my ignorance. His full name is Fred John Philip Gibson. He is a 28-year-old British singer, songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, record producer, and remixer in the genres of pop, dance pop, house, and hip hop. Here's what Fred Again had to say. "People tell me I've made a joyful record, but to me it's devastating. The album, Actual Life, was impacted by the worsening illness of a very close friend. The song, Me Heavy, is the one that's most about death, but people say it sounds really hopeful. Perhaps I was subconsciously trying to find some sort of positivity while everything around felt tragic. Most of the really optimistic people I know have become like that after really challenging circumstances. The album is a diary of other people's moments in life. I recorded Carlos, a construction worker in Atlanta, saying, 'Friend, we're gonna make it through.' And he was a song just waiting for some music. Before, I wasn't so bothered about how my music resonated. Now, the meaningful messages I've had from people who've heard the album already and found it inspiring will stay with me forever. I'm proud to have had that effect." And now, here is the music video for the song, "We've Lost Dancing." Fair warning, you may not be able to resist moving to the beat. Definitely a prophet. Fred Again posted the following in a comment below the music video. "Instead of looking at this video as a compilation of things you've missed, I'd really recommend looking at it as a compilation of things that are to come." Our second reading comes from Psalms 36, verses 5 to 10. "Your love, O God, reaches to the heavens, your faithfulness to the skies. Your righteousness is like the mountains in their splendor, your justice like the great deep. Whether human or animal, O God, you keep us all in your care. How priceless is your love. Your people take refuge under the shadow of your wings. They feast upon the abundance of your house. You give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the wellspring of life, and in your light we become enlightened. Continue your loving kindness to those who know you, and your justice for upright hearts. When I stop to think about it, I am hard-pressed to think of a single adult that I know who is doing great right now. Take a moment to think about it. Do you personally know someone who is thriving right now? Are you? I mean, there has to be someone somewhere, and if you are amongst us and you want to reveal yourself, we will do our best to welcome you with open, non-bitter arms. If you are in a phase of life where things are going your way, I am so very glad for you. But most of us are in the same boat, the one called, things are not so great right now, and that's putting it mildly. We're reminding each other that it's more than okay to not be okay. I mean, let's take stock of this moment. If we were going to create a time capsule that represented this particular time in history, what items would we include? I could include my day planner with all the crossed out, canceled plans. We'd have to include KN95 masks and a rapid test. Oh wait, I can't get my hands on one of those. And if I could, it would be too precious to use as a sign of the times. And let's face it, many of us can't even afford them. Many of us would have to include funeral programs as we face losses at every turn. Might you include a few strands of the hair you pulled out last week when you found out that your kids were going back to online learning? As Omicron tips the scales and lands us in a similar place to where we were 2 whole years ago, I wonder what item could represent the 1-year anniversary of the January 6th Capitol insurrection, or the lack of consensus about what actually happened that day. If you feel inclined, I invite you to add something in the chat that you'd put into our collective time capsule or your personal one. So when President Joe Biden says that this is one of the toughest years we've ever faced as a nation, it doesn't even sound like political rhetoric. It just sounds possibly true. We're feeling angry and sad, frustrated, abandoned, or maybe so numb that we barely feel anything at all. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday we celebrate as a national holiday tomorrow, knew something about struggling to feel joy. He reflected on this on a trip to India in 1959. He noticed that India is one of the few points in all the world where you can see the setting of the sun and the rising of the moon simultaneously. Not surprisingly, Dr. King turned this observation into a theological metaphor, saying, God has the light that can shine through all the darkness. We have experiences when the light of day vanishes, leaving us in some dark and desolate midnight. Moments when our highest hopes are turned into shambles of despair, and when we are victims of some tragic injustice and some terrible exploitation. During such moments, our spirits are almost overcome by gloom and despair, and we feel that there is no light anywhere. But ever and again, we look towards the east and discover that there is another light which shines, even in the darkness, and the spear of frustration is transformed into a shaft of light. As for me, I find myself at the start of this new year feeling low-grade despair, just as I recognize that I myself am carrying what Dr. King calls the spear of frustration. It's also time for me to develop and preach a sermon. Some of you may be surprised that not all of our sermons get delivered directly from on high through divine inspiration. Some get developed through Google searches from melancholy middle-aged women who enter the phrase, "If not hope, then what?" ? That's how I stumbled upon the article and music video from the first reading. The title of the article came from another featured artist, MC Taylor, the lead singer of an American folk music band called His Golden Messenger. Here's what MC Taylor had to say and how he came up with my sermon title and asked the same existential question that I have. And I quote, "If not hope, then what? That is the essential question of being for me now. What is the alternative? I don't necessarily consider myself a rock of hopefulness. I don't think of myself as someone that can walk into a room and animate it with visions of unfettered joy and possibility.
We've lost the hugs.
However, as the father of 2 children, ages 8 and 12, who continually bear witness to the injustices of our world, I believe that part of my obligation to them is to offer a picture of the world while based in reality, interprets any small cracks in the forces that work against them, against us, as seeds of potential for a better world, one that is fairer and more just. Otherwise, how could I talk to them about climate change, or the murder of George Floyd by a cop, or the marshaling of untruth, racism, and xenophobia in pursuit of money and power all over the globe without breaking down? This type of hope has to be intentional. It takes work in the same way that a mindfulness meditation practice does. You do it enough, and you start to see sparks of hope in places you didn't expect them. You also notice the things that want to extinguish those sparks. So maybe quietly blowing it, though I certainly wasn't thinking of it as such when I was writing it, is in part a gathering of some seeds of hope, as well as a reckoning of the battles that we face. In other words, the sanctuary and the ways that those in power will break us on the wheel for our truth-telling. But if not hope, then what? End quote. Our Bible passage in Psalms seems like a really high bar when we read, "They feast upon the abundance of your house. You give them drink from the river of your delights." How do we reconcile God's lofty promises with the reality of our circumstances? What can we do to feel hopeful? And why are these particular questions the premise of every sermon that I write? I'm convinced that one way to be intentional about fostering hope is to tell each other and ourselves the truth through our own stories. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Silly ones are welcome too. When Sidney Poitier died on January 6th, we lost an American treasure. He was so great at telling stories about his own life in that rich, deep, kind voice of his. He told the story about how he, the son of Bahamian tomato farmers, who sent him to America at age 15 when he got into some trouble, stumbled into acting. He was working as a dishwasher in New York when he saw an ad seeking actors for the American Negro Theater. When he got to the audition, he lied about his acting experience and failed miserably to deliver lines smoothly from a script, given that he could barely read at the time. The guy conducting the audition stopped him after only a few words and became irate. He placed both hands on him, and as he was physically removing him from the theater, he said, "You're not an actor. How dare you waste my time? Go get a job as a dishwasher." As Sidney walked away, something dawned on him. He had never shared that he actually did work as a dishwasher, yet those were the limitations that this stranger placed on him. Sidney speaks of how offended he felt, and in that moment, he decided that he would pursue acting just to prove this stranger wrong. Despite discrimination and stereotypes, he went on to become the first Black man to win the Oscar for Best Actor, to transform America itself, and he opted to become what was amounted to the Hollywood division of the civil rights movement. This is intention setting at its best. The new year offers an opportunity to take stock and set intentions. And while many of us roll our eyes when asked about New Year's resolutions, I'm certain that naming what matters is a worthwhile endeavor, especially when everything feels upside down. I learned that people have been making choices for the future and reflecting on past choices at the start of the new year as early as 4,000 years ago. But most of those ceremonies and rituals were built around commitment to the gods, or God with a capital G, like commitments to pay debts owed or to celebrate another harvest year. Since the new year wasn't marked by January 1st, but it was marked in mid-March when it was time to start a new season of planting. It's only been recently where New Year's resolutions are made to ourselves for our own self-improvement. Where are you most comfortable? Is it when you're planning for the future, anchored in the present, or is reflecting on the past your specialty? As I age, I definitely enjoy spending some time reflecting and getting others to reflect on what we can learn from our life experiences. It's one of the ways that God is still speaking. And we look ahead better when we know where we've come from. Someone who helped me reflect back on 2021 and look forward to 2022 was Kendra Adachi. She is the host of the Lazy Genius podcast. The premise of the podcast is that we should all choose what things to be geniuses about and what things to be lazy about. She listed 30 beautiful questions for the start of a new year. I'll share some of the questions. Answer some or all yourself. Answer with long answers or just a few words. Put them in the chat. Write them down on paper or in your heart. Maybe gather a group of beloveds over Zoom and listen to each other's stories like I did, including a lovely conversation with my eldest daughter, Anaya, and her friend since pre-K, Annie, to capture what they learned about themselves in their first year away from home as college freshmen. If a particular question resonates with you, feel free to share your response in the chat. I'll also share a few of my own responses. Okay, here we go. What was the most energizing thing you did last year? What was the most restful thing you did? For me, it was the 2-month discernment leave this church granted me. What has changed in you that you're proud of? What was your favorite article of clothing or outfit? What made you laugh? For me, it was a conversation with my daughters when they were pleading with Aaron and I to purchase new laundry baskets that weren't in such disrepair that every time you do a load of laundry, you risk cutting your hands on the jagged plastic edges where handles used to be. I see some nods. I think I'm not the only one who owns those. What was something that felt hard at the start of last year, but is easier now? What are you glad that you finished or started? For me, it was following an intuition of our very own church member, Nyla Francis. On April 27th, she sent an email to women she called glorious humans and healers. She shared that she envisioned the creation of a grief processional, essentially a parade, as an outward expression and acknowledgement of the griefs we carry. That invitation led to the Salt Trails Collective. We create community grief experiences to remind us that we are not alone. What did you miss last year? Who did you miss? As a reminder, I encourage you to share some responses with each other in the chat. What made you feel like yourself? For me, it was exchanging Marco Polo videos with 7 beloved friends. What mattered most last year for you? Think about it. This is an easy one for me. Hands down, it was surrounding Lori, our mom, with love at the end of her life and soaking up all of the goodness she had to offer as a gift that will endure forever. What didn't matter as much as you thought it would? What did you learn about yourself? What habits, rituals, and rhythms do you hope for? What do you want to finish? What do you want to start? Based on last year, what advice would you give yourself moving into this new year? Finally, what do you think will matter most in 2022? Collectively for us, it may be trying on what it feels like to not have Linda in our midst regularly, even as we mourn her daily presence. Kendra Adachi gives us instructions for setting intentions as a spiritual practice. Okay, she doesn't actually describe it that way, but I do. She reminds us that the way to be kind to ourselves and to avoid the trope of abandoned resolutions is to leave space for things to change. So here's the instructions that she recommends for the practice. You set an intention, then you lived with it until things shift. And then you incorporate that new reality and tweak the original or set a new intention. Talk with God about your goals and plans and try to listen for their voice and encouragement. You could even use Psalm 36 as a mantra of faith. Your love, O God, reaches to the heavens, your faithfulness to the skies. Your righteousness is like the mountains in their splendor, your justice like the great deep. Whether human or animal, O God, you keep us all in your care. How priceless is your love. Your people take refuge under the shadow of your wings. They feast upon the abundance of your house. You give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the wellspring of life, and in your light we become enlightened. Continue your loving kindness to those who know you, and your justice for upright hearts. Getting back to the instruction manual for setting intentions as a spiritual practice, celebrate when you meet even the smallest milestone, and be kind to yourself when you don't. Let's lean on each other to find some sort of positivity while everything around us feels tragic. Reminding each other of what Carlos, the construction worker from Atlanta, said in that music video. Friends, we're gonna make it through. I too want to be a song just waiting for some music. To quote MC Taylor again, this type of hope has to be intentional. You do it enough and you start to see sparks of hope in places you didn't expect. And maybe more importantly, you start to notice the things that want to extinguish those sparks. This noticing gives us the opportunity to organize ourselves against oppressive forces. Because to quote Reverend Dr. King again, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Great things often happen in the wake of loss and suffering. When we're not strong enough ourselves, we must find others to tend to our fragile hearts so that we might be each other's sanctuary. And sometimes we have to find the courage to walk away from situations that negate our joy. When we encounter someone who is feeling hopeless, we can remind them that God's love reaches to the heavens and God's faithfulness reaches to the skies. When they can't hope for themselves, we can be hope for them. If we can just live through the next 6 months, day by day, what comes next will be marvelous, because it has to be. But if not hope, then what? This is God's good news. Amen.